of Edinburgh, but I'm joining you from France.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it. Let's give him a warm welcome.
I will share my screen, but I must first share with you, I guess. Can you see? Great. So yes, thank you. My name is Axel Karamercan, and I'm affiliated with the University of Edinburgh. I'm a philosopher and then a Dickinson scholar. So hope you excuse if I miss anything about Emily Dickinson. This paper is part of my ongoing research on Dickinson's sense of place and being in the world, which I approach from a philosophical perspective in dialogue with 20th century continental thinkers, especially with Martin Heidegger. Today, I will be presenting a shortened version of an article that will appear in the upcoming special ecology issue of the Emily Dickinson Journal. In the paper, I argue that Dickinson's nature poetry resists both the subject-centered orientation of classical phenomenology and the holistic tendency of certain ecophenomenological perspectives. When we study Dickinson's poetry at the limits of phenomenology, we see that she writes from a horizon of place that puts the very home of human experience into question. I argue that Dickinson's poetry opens a way of thinking topologically that neither isolates the human nor erases the difference between human and non-human. She identifies the boundary and the place at which human dwelling and the natural world belong together in their difference. Dickinson writes in a letter to Elizabeth Holland, "Travel wide to nature when she dwells with us." Dickinson's philosophical wonder draws her lyrics into a sustained inquiry into nature, which also entails questioning the very grounds of asking what nature is. However, Dickinson also writes in what mystery pervades the world, but nature is a stranger yet. The ones that cite her most have never passed her haunted house. Dickinson's skeptical attitude becomes very explicit in the poem, "Nature is what we see." Nature is what we see, the hill, the afternoon, squirrel, eclipse, the bumblebee. Nay, nature is heaven. Nature is what we hear, the bubbling, the sea, thunder, the cricket. Nay, nature is harmony. Nature is what we know, but have no art to say. So impotent our wisdom is to her sincerity. With this poem, the main question that I want us to think about is, why does Dickinson write the word nature in quotation marks? Two further questions can help us think this through. Why isn't she satisfied with each definition she provides, line after line? What does it mean to say that we have no art to say nature in a poem? After all, if you really have no art to say it, then what is this poem about? At first, it may seem as if the poem goes against its own idea, but I argue that Dickinson is doing something much more nuanced. She is telling us something about the finitude of language and poetry through nature. She is demarcating the boundaries of saying and not saying. Christian Gerhardt puts the matter well in A Place for Humility, arguing that Dickinson's humility invites us to think about the limits of human knowledge without being restrictive. In Dickinson's poetry, the insight into nature's alterity goes beyond the acceptance of philosophical skepticism. It also goes beyond confronting the limited ability of language, even lyrical language, to grasp or embody the phenomenal world. Dickinson frequently expresses a sense of human as being always outside of and apart from nature, and thus not only essentially incapable of knowing nature, but also potentially disruptive and appropriative. Yet she keeps attempting the impossible, to carve out a language that allows their speakers to relate to nature in non-dominating ways. Dickinson takes our access to things through appearances seriously. Her poetry thinks at the threshold between saying and not saying, between dwelling and being displaced. This threshold is precisely the boundary where the question of our home, eco in Latin, or oikos in Greek, in the world arises. Although Gerard does not explicitly mention phenomenology here, let me explain why phenomenology offers a fruitful way of reading Dickinson's poetry. First, let me briefly say a few words about the phenomenological method. Husserl founded phenomenology as a science of pure experience, a return, as he put it, to the things themselves. Its decisive move was to reverse a long metaphysical hierarchy that had always ranked appearances beneath essences. If we study carefully how phenomena appear to us, phenomenologists argue, we gain access to the things themselves. From there, Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty reorient the discipline away from pure consciousness, and they move towards the embodied, situated worldly experience, towards being and dwelling. So the question is, what distinguishes ecophenomenology from phenomenology? Ecophenomenology is a contemporary branch of phenomenology that announces a turn to the earth itself. While one might argue that in Dickinson we see a similar turn to the earth itself, such unity is not without its own complex issues and set of philosophical problems. Contemporary philosopher David Wood addresses precisely this challenge. Phenomenology was born out of resistance to the threat of naturalism. But if phenomenology is to be able to think about nature, it must either rescue nature itself from naturalism or work out a new relationship to what it had perceived as the danger of naturalism, or both. So naturalism here refers to the philosophical position that reduces all experience to natural scientific explanation, the view that phenomenology originally opposes. What is needed is a way to think nature that neither dismisses scientific understanding nor surrenders the irreducible dimension of lived experience to it. So now let me return to the poem. If I can. Yes. In the poem, we can better see how the quotation marks help Dickinson test her ontological desire to articulate what nature is by bringing the limits of her saying as a poet into view. Hill, afternoon, squirrel, eclipse, bumblebee, heaven, bobolink, sea, thunder, cricket, and harmony, the things of the world, can be understood as different expressions of nature, yet we can never fully demonstrate what nature is as such from our human perspective. Moving beyond mere metaphysical postulation, Dickinson speaks from the very end of human language. Nature in itself is what we know. However, saying this is possible only in a poetry that heeds the place, or topos, from which human being speaks. In this way, Dickinson arrives at the outermost margins of language, while also experiencing the limits of phenomenology almost half a century before its appearance as a philosophical movement. If Dickinson's nature emerges at the limits of phenomenological saying, language itself comes into view as the originary site, originary place, where any disclosure of nature can happen. We might be tempted to say that nature is all. However, the very possibility of saying that nature is all belongs to a specifically human mode of being in the world. It belongs to hermeneutic beings like ourselves, that is, beings capable of interpreting things as things, and therefore naming and saying what they are, rather than merely communicating in order to satisfy biological needs. So language is something that belongs to us and something that defines our nature. And it puts us into nature in a very particular way that might not be the case for other animals or non-human animals or other beings. And that is something that makes us the kinds of being that we are. With this in mind, the striking use of quotation marks around nature in this poem can be read as a hint of phenomenological epoche, or bracketing of the world. The method of epoche, or phenomenological reduction, brackets the scientific, historical, and other conditions under which phenomena become visible, so that they themselves may be interrogated in themselves. This suspension allows us to investigate how phenomena appear and enable an approach to the things themselves through the structures of appearance and understanding and language. This is the epoche Dickinson performs with a single typographical gesture. The quotation marks around nature bracket the word itself, suspending our assumptions that we already know what nature is. Dickinson knows that what she can experience is not nature as a fixed entity or simply a real phenomenon out there. The same reserve, the refusal to treat nature as something she can fully possess or fix in place, also shapes how she positions herself among other living beings. Even though Dickinson's poetry resists a Cartesian, ego-centered detachment from the world, it holds on to a nuanced relation to the non-human. This appears, for example, in her poem, How Soft a Caterpillar Steps, where a caterpillar crossing her hand carries her toward its own velvet world, without her claiming to know that the world from within. I won't be able to unpack the poem here, but I'm glad to return to it in the discussion. Dickinson's sense of humility does not allow her to speculate about an immediate human nature unity. Dickinson speaks from a threshold of ecological otherness that is grounded in phenomenological access to experience and appearance. Her commitment to a human-non-human distinction or distantiation can be read as a cautious move against the simplified anthropocentrism and equally against some versions of ecological holism, the view that would dissolve human and non-human life into a single undifferentiated whole. The language of more or less vis-a-vis the non-human already presupposes a human measure. The question of whether non-human living beings possess or need a concept of world risks projecting human categories onto forms of life that may not share our mode of being in the world. This same awareness of the limits of human knowledge and finitude appears elsewhere in Dickinson's poetry, perhaps most directly in a poem about perception. Perception of an object costs precise the object's loss. Perception in itself, again, replying to its price. The object absolute is not. Perception sets it fair, and then upbraids a perfectness that situates so far. As Marion Noble also shows, for the phenomenologist, there is no such thing as the object absolute. Though we might lack an absolute apperception of the object itself, we gain perception instead, and that is the greater gain. Once we see the manner in which Dickinson cracks open the opposition between transcendental idealism, that we know the world only as it appears through the constitutive structures of human cognition, and metaphysical realism, that reality exists independently of human perception, we can better see how her situated poetry in the between holds inside and outside together in the singular yet fragmented taking place of the world. But this, I argue, is not a turn to the human subject or to subjects themselves. This is a turn to the place of subjectivity and human agency. Dickinson always writes from a placed, embodied position, making the place of experience a fundamental question of her poetry. Dickinson does not rely on the shift from the object absolute to the subject absolute, but on the boundaries of the human nature correlation. I argue that Dickinson's poetry preserves ontological difference, perceptual asymmetry, and ethical reserve in the human-non-human relation, hospitality rather than unity, neighborhood rather than fusion. Reading her on the verge of ecophenomenology aims to recover this position at a moment when environmental thought often oscillates between recentering the human or dissolving it. The impossible possibility of Dickinsonian humility is the challenge to engage with the world without reducing phenomena to the constructions of the human mind, while remaining attentive to our finite relation to that world. It is from this position of being both within and without that Dickinson seeks to reorient the human subject in the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. All right. Shall we move forward to the next presenter in the interest of time? Jungi. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
Okay, I will share my screen.
Yeah, please share your screen. And while you're doing that, I'm just going to briefly introduce you. He's currently pursuing a master's degree in comparative literature and world literature at Fudan University. And his talk is Mycelium Spreading, Emily Dickinson's Mushroom Poems.
Okay.
Please go ahead whenever you're ready.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good night, everyone. I'm Jungi Zhou. It's a great pleasure to join the annual meeting online. My presentation focuses on Dickinson's mushroom poems, but I'd like to begin with a word that doesn't appear in her poetry, mycelium. Unlike the fruiting body that briefly emerges above the ground, mycelium refers to the hidden network through which fungi connected with their surroundings and other forms of life. It also spreads across Dickinson's manuscripts, her attention to marginal species, and her poetic imagination. Through this, I hope to bring Dickinson into conversation with Donna Haraway. In the summer of 1874, Dickinson wrote back to Higginson and mentioned blossoms and books. She explained that existence has overpowered books, making blossoms the focus. It is in this context that she writes, "Today I threw a mushroom," followed by a short poem where the mushroom is called a surreptitious scion. This letter raises two questions. Is there a dislocation between blossoms and the mushroom? What does surreptitious scion reveal? In the 18th and 19th centuries, taxonomy became one of the primary ways of studying and organizing the natural world. Linnaeus, through his system of classification and naming, established a framework in which species could be identified and placed within an ordered system. Mushrooms were no exception. In system nature, Linnaeus classified them among the cryptogamic plants. For Linnaeus, species were understood as distinct and stable forms that could be discovered and classified through careful observation. Dickinson's knowledge of mushrooms mainly came from the botanic textbook Familiar Lectures on Botany, which she used during her school years. This book continues the Linnaeus tradition of classification and describes the class of cryptogamia, which included lichens, mushrooms, ferns, and mosses. Edward Tuckman, a significant figure in the Amherst Circle, also adopted this way of understanding the natural world, and his studies of lichens seem to offer a historical context for Dickinson's interest in marginal species. This image comes from fungi selectivity. The paintings were produced by Ora White Hitchcock, and the botanic names were later added by her husband, Edward Hitchcock. Both were closely connected with the Amherst Circle. Their work also reflects the rich natural resources of Amherst, where mushrooms and other less noticeable forms of life attracted great attention. In the textbook, Phelps described the cryptogamous plant as probably the least understood of all the visible works of nature. She suggests that scientists might devote years to studying a moss or mushroom because such investigations continually brought new discoveries. The mushroom, therefore, occupied a marginal position in botanic classification, but this very marginality made it an object of scientific fascination. Therefore, it's not surprising that mushroom attracted Dickinson's attention. In this short poem, the collected flower quickly draws the attention of a scholar holding a glass. Following Linnaeus' method, the monster calculates the number of stamens and places the flower into a particular class. The irony here reminds us that Dickinson's attitude towards classification is critical. Such an act scientifically locates species, but it also cuts the nature world into rigid units that lack flexibility. From the perspective of manuscript, Dickinson created a group of mushroom poems consisting of 6 manuscript versions, one of which has been lost. In my previous research, I examined these manuscripts through genetic criticism. I argue that their diverse forms established an analogy with the biologic structure of mushrooms. An individual manuscript is only the visible fruiting body, while the poem's true significance lies in the relationships among manuscripts. In this presentation, I will focus on the version that Dickinson transcribed and included in a set, which is regarded as the final manuscript. Okay, this mushroom poem continuously responds to a question: what is a mushroom? Of course, Dickinson adopts a familiar strategy here. She avoids answering the question directly. More precisely, she refuses scientific definitions. Instead, she either uses different negations or creates multiple poetic metaphors. The mushroom is an elf, a juggler, a surreptitious scion, and an upstate. Firstly, Dickinson uses the word elf to define the mushroom. To understand this image, we may turn to the 19th century interest in fairy mythology. Dickinson was familiar with these fairy traditions. Catley described elves as creatures associated with hidden spaces and mysterious activities, and he also mentioned the fairy rings found in fields and meadows. This folkloric image provides a different way of imagining the mushroom. Rather than define it as a fixed botanic object within a system of classification, Dickinson presents it through association, transforming the mushroom into an elusive and mysterious presence. However, the expression of plant still places the mushroom within the plant world, echoing the language of botanic classification. The first line therefore reveals 2 different ways of understanding a species. This tension is also important in Donna Haraway's thinking about situated knowledges. An object of knowledge is never simply a passive thing waiting to be discovered. It is shaped through the relationships between the object and the observer. To understand the mushroom, we need a double vision. We recognize the visible fruiting body before us while remaining aware of the limits of our linguistic science and living space for the invisible Mycelium network. We can only grasp the mushroom through its momentary appearance, the visible fruiting body. The word truffle is particularly suggestive here, since its Latin origin carries associations with underground growth and hiddenness. Like a juggler, the mushroom seems to employ different tricks, producing a limited form of observation in which what we see can never fully represent what it is. From Haraway's perspective, this identity is grounded in the materiality of the mushroom itself. Beyond the direct observation, the mycelium quietly spread, creating a broader and more complex network. of relations. Moss and the mushroom belong to the same fascinating group of cryptogamous plant. In this poem, after the speaker of beauty and truth recognize their kinship, they continue their conversation until the moss has reached our lips and covered up our names. Here, moss grows at the margins of human existence, gradually covering language, identity, and even names. The image reveals the limits of observations and classification. What appears small may eventually transform the very boundaries through which we understand the world. Benefiting from the limits of observation and the underground spread of mycelium, the mushroom achieved an ecological feat. Specifically, mushrooms are widely distributed and establish relationships with various species within their habitats. In Dickinson's mushroom poem, the mushroom is deliberately placed within a multi-species landscape. Its career becomes connected with both the animal and plant kingdoms. For humans, the mushroom may only appear as a surreptitious sign, but other beings, like grass, don't concern themselves with its scientific uncertainty. Instead, they welcome its ability to intermit. So relations like mycelium spread across species. This perspective also helps us reconsider F71. Dickinson presents some visible fruiting bodies and invites readers to explore the underground mycelium, or in other words, the complex ecological relations of a multi-species landscape. And Dickinson's frequent use of the hyphen becomes the line of a fungal network. In this sense, Dickinson, through poetic intuition, anticipated a vision that would later become a philosophical concern. For Haraway, the tentacular are not isolated beings, but nets and networks composed through multiple lines of connection. They exist not as separate points, but through interlaced trails among human and non-human beings. As a companion species, mushrooms deeply influence the survival of some species, a relationship often overlooked by human observers. One example is the Indian pipe, one of Dickinson's favorite flowers. Its roots live with specific fungi, which help it absorb nutrients. These two marginal creatures form a symbiotic relationship, and Dickinson herself once accidentally placed them together in a letter. It is this hidden relationship that gives the Indian pipe its supernatural quality and deeply attracted the poet. Haraway's further insights help us better understand mycelium symbiosis among species. It is not only essential for the survival of species, but also blurs the boundary between life and death. In this poem, the Indian pipe becomes a material mean through which the soul of the dead can be perceived. Its translucent texture activates the images of lace and fog, suggesting that death is not pure darkness, but something that can be realized through life. This leads us to Dickinson's herbarian specimen of the Indian pipe. Although the flower has fallen away, the traces reveal a connection between the present and what is lost. However, the mushroom may appear to humans as merely a trouble. In the final stanza of the mushroom poem, the mushroom is called an obstate, disrupting the sacred atmosphere created by walls. This reminds me of Dickinson's famous fly, which similarly intrudes upon a sacred moment. Through her rebellious spirit, Dickinson reveals the conflicts between humans and other species. In Haraway's world, this is a form of indigestion, rooted in the fact that humans rely on the weapon of science, when encountering other beings. The mushroom, therefore, provides an excellent entry for rethinking these relationships. Finally, it is necessary to acknowledge that Haraway is not the only theorist who enters into dialogue with Dickinson. In other words, Dickinson seemed to have anticipated a philosophical moment whose important contributor was also Deleuze, who explores the ontological standards of relations through the concept of the raison. In staying with the trouble, Haraway uses the picture of the string figure to understand the mushrooms and the tentacular thinking. Returning to the letter with which I began, I suggest that Dickinson may have adopted a gentle model. These deeper tentacles cannot be dominated by linguistic science, nor do they possess bridges. They are water, spreading everywhere and existing everywhere. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Really amazing paper. And these are just awesome. For our next presenter, we are actually going to have a recording for Thomas. And let me just briefly introduce him. Our next presenter is Thomas W. Howard. He's an assistant professor of humanities at Bilkent University in Ankara, Turkey. And his presentation is entitled, where'd it go? Dickinson's Gnomic Letters, Botanical Immortality and Circumference in the Correspondence.
Okay, so I'm going to help Howard to play his video. Can everyone see this? Okay, then let me try to play. Okay.
I'm thrilled to speak that the 2025 Critical Institute in Taipei is supported. But first, I want to say a word about the Critical Institute itself. When I attended my very first EDIS conference in 2022 in Seville, it was largely for the Critical Institute. The support that it offers to graduate students and junior scholars is one of the things that makes this society great. And I can say unequivocally that my continued work in Dickinson studies is due to this event and the people who make it happen. So thank you. Last summer, I shared work from my ongoing book project, tentatively entitled Aphoristic Science, Ecology, Psychology, and 19th Century American Literature. In this project, I trace a transatlantic genealogy of the scientific aphorism, a compact observational form that emerged with Francis Bacon, developed around the turn of the 19th century through German writers like Lichtenberg and Goethe, and surfaced in American figures like Emerson, Thoreau, and Dickinson. What binds these writers is a shared intuition that knowledge grows best in fragments, concise enough to hold a single observation, but open enough to keep inquiry alive. My chapter on Dickinson positions her as an active participant in this tradition, in which her letter writing served as a laboratory of its own, especially when handling botanical topics. In the selection for my Critical Institute group, I argue that Dickinson's botanical letters enact a polarity, a close attention to plant detail held in tension with an openness to interpretation. For Samuel Taylor Coleridge, this polarity finds its analog in astronomy, where centripetal and centrifugal forces remain in a productive tension. And openness to inquiry and interpretation is a key feature of the epistolary form, which necessarily demands a response. Thus, this centrifugal openness, or what some critics describe as deciphering a riddle, is central to Dickinson's letter-writing project. In the broader scheme of the book, my Dickinson chapter emphasizes her role in enacting a participatory science, especially for women who are systematically excluded from professionalized science. Even the young Dickinson held this value, which we can see in her early letters to her childhood friend, Abaya Root. Since Abaya had moved away to Philadelphia, the written correspondence was their sole means of contact. The letters are full of regular updates on life, as when Dickinson lists her school subjects that term: mental philosophy, geology, Latin, and botany. It is in this latter class in which she created her famous herbarium, of which she writes to Abaya. My plants look finely now. I'm going to send you a little geranium leaf in this letter, which you must press for me. Have you made you an herbarium yet? I hope you will if you have not. It would be such a treasure to you. Most all the girls are making one. If you do, perhaps I can make some additions to it from flowers growing around here. Recent scholarship has emphasized Dickinson's scientific education, but what we see here is an early example of Dickinson practicing science. An herbarium requires the collection and identification of plant specimens. And as Mabel Loomis Todd mentions in her 1894 edition of the Letters, young Dickinson was highly knowledgeable of the environs around Amherst. Indeed, there is a case to place her alongside Susan Fenimore Cooper and Henry David Thoreau as great American protoecologists. But in this letter, Dickinson is particularly scientific in asking the question, have you made an herbarium yet? What we have to remember is how the culture of science in the 19th century expanded via personal friendships in just this way. In an essay on American women in 19th century scientific correspondence, Tina Giaquinto points to the example of Jane Gray, the wife of Harvard botanist Asa Gray, who maintained a correspondence with Charles Darwin. She not only influenced Darwin's thinking, but also contributed insights that appear in The Descent of Man. Such correspondence networks were dying out over the course of the century. Scientific professionalization and the rise of scientific periodicals gradually replaced the need for such personal relationships. But Gray and Darwin demonstrate that there was yet a residual republic of letters in the 19th century that vitally included women. I position Dickinson within this remnant republic of letters, especially within her primary field of inquiry, botany. A comparison with Asa Gray will be useful here. Gray's 1848 Manual of the Botany of the Northern United States depended largely on a correspondence network for the specimens that would make it truly representative of that region. Similarly, as Mary Kuhn has shown, Dickinson herself had received botanical specimens from around the world, including India, Europe, and the Levant. And in her letter to Abaya, she offers to send some flowers growing around here for inclusion in a new herbarium project. So from a young age, Dickinson had intuited, if not outright recognized, the significance of sending flowers as not only a form of gift giving, but also a scientific practice. But my argument is not only that Dickinson participates in botanical science, it is also that she does so with a particular writing style, what I call the aphoristic mode. The aphorism is concise, but it is also a borderline form that verges on poetry. It becomes useful for science in its open-endedness. Reading and writing in the aphoristic mode encourages further inquiry, pushing beyond the boundaries of the aphoristic statement itself. The scientific aphorism thus functions not as a gem-like statement of universal truth. It's no axiom. Rather, it is a seed that grows in the mind of the receptive reader. Thus, in her poetry, Dickinson rejects the scientific axiom in favor of what she calls experiment. As a pithy statement of established truth, the axiom petrifies inquiry. Experiment, or what she calls elsewhere wild experiment, inspires continued movement. And it is in this realm of wild experiment that the aphoristic mode lives. Among the aphoristic thinkers in aphoristic science, all conceive of this continuous movement as not linear, but as a circular motion. In his essay Circles, Ralph Waldo Emerson describes this inquiry as the drawing of a new circle. Thoreau revises this in his essay Walking into a parabola, or a non-returning curve. Within this genealogy, or what we might imagine as a sort of spiraling tradition, Dickinson's own theme of circumference fits very well. In general parlance, a circumference of a circle is its outer boundary. Circumference thus has an aphoristic sense to it, since the etymology of aphorism includes the word horos, the Greek for boundary, from which we get the word horizon. But the prefix of the word is apo, meaning away from. As I argue in my book project, there is an important polarity to this prefix. To move away from the boundary may mean moving inward toward the center of the circle. Here is where lies the closed-off sense of the aphorism, the more colloquial sense today that we might see of pithy maxims or quotable lines. But this apo can also mean a moving out, away from the exterior of the boundary, like a rocket reaching escape velocity from the Earth's gravitational horizon. In Dickinson's case, I argue, both senses coexist. Her writing becomes short and condensed, but the possible meaning expands outward. Both ideas are thus in a productive tension. Here's where Coleridge becomes relevant. In his Biographia Literaria, Coleridge uses an analogy with astronomy to show how intelligence exists as dual forces in tension. Intelligence is not a static substance, a mind stuff, as others have suggested. Instead, intelligence is a self-development consisting of two opposite and counteracting forces, which, by a metaphor borrowed from astronomy, we might call the centrifugal and centripetal forces. The mind, always in a process of development, is constantly pulled in different directions. Early beliefs and morals within the mind might be in tension with new ideas found in books or conversation. But this duality also extends to the very faculties of the mind, which Coleridge describes with polar pairings like reason versus understanding, or imagination versus fancy. In these distinctions, one side is more centripetal, pulling the mind inward. Fancy, for instance, reorganizes mental materials already within the mind, but imagination is creative and transformative. It dissolves and diffuses ideas. And while the centrifugal pole is clearly privileged for Coleridge, he emphasizes the need for both forces. Like the mechanics of astronomy, the mind relies on these two poles remaining in a productive tension. Imagination requires the association of materials that fancy provides. Dickinson's Circumference reflects a similar polarity. Her condensed poetry and letters require fancy in so much as she rearranges language for her poetic purposes, but it is in the broader vision offered by imagination where her suggestive dimension lies. While Circumference may bound the textual limits of the letter or poem, its suggestiveness makes it open-ended, encouraging readers to move away from the boundary toward new ideas. Critics frequently speak to Dickinson's openness. Regarding her religious uncertainty, for instance, Renee Berglund writes, Dickinson's insistent open-mindedness can seem heroic. Her reluctance to choose between different words or between different ideological stances is a central feature of her poetry. Sharon Cameron makes a similar claim about Dickinson's fascicles. Thus, as we turn back to Dickinson's botanical letters, it's this polarity, this textual brevity matched with suggestive open-endedness that makes her writing particularly aphoristic. In the longer paper, I examine other early letters where Dickinson provides what I call a textual herbarium, such as her list of species growing around Mount Holyoke. But an early letter that best demonstrates Dickinson's centrifugal tendency is the ultimate letter she sent. The friendship was warm, and Dickinson turns favorite flower, the lion, which she transforms into an ambiguous, open-ended image, ending grief. She writes, I had hardly recovered myself from the dismay attendant upon entering august assemblies, when with the utmost equanimity you ascended the stairs, bedecked with dandelions, arranged, it seems, for curls. O Abaya, you and the early flower are forever linked to me. As soon as the first green grass comes, up from a chink in the stones peeps the little flower, precious Leontodon, and my heart fills toward you with a warm and childlike fullness. In the memory, Abaya and the dandelion have merged. She's not merely wearing the flowers in her hair, but the dandelions have become one with the curls. But moreover, Dickinson describes how the flower has come to replace her absentee companion. In their years apart, the flower has transformed into the botanical form of Abaya. Yet, it is the use of the term Leontodon that I find Dickinson at her most imaginative and centrifugal. The Latin term, often a means for clear classification, here allows Dickinson to inject some ambiguity into her text. By naming only the genus, she doesn't name the species, and in New England, this could point to various plants. In Jacob Bigelow's Plants of Boston, for instance, the common dandelion is Leontodon taraxacum. But just above this entry is the Leontodon autumnale, an invasive species that is unique because it blooms so late. It begins flowering in June and July, Bigelow writes, and is nearly the last plant that yields to the frosts of November. The Leontodon autumnale is thus an image of resilience, a dandelion surviving through the fall into the earliest days of winter. And as Dickinson's friendship with Abaya turns cold, this botanical figure replaces her earlier image of the common dandelion in Abaya's hair. What makes this passage more suggestive is its status as a line in a letter, a piece of correspondence. The openness that I find in the term Leontodon requires some knowledge of botany, but it's unclear how this reference would land for Abaya. We don't know if Abaya ever became interested in botany, or if she ever heeded Dickinson's call to keep an herbarium. It's impossible to say, therefore, how Leontodon would have landed for its original recipient. Maybe it was just a poetic flourish for her. But for Dickinson, the letter functioned as a correspondence in a variety of ways, as a sent letter, but also as the establishment of a relationship between the dandelion and Dickinson. The latter sense is more Emersonian correspondence, the relationship between human beings and the natural world that, according to Stephanie A. Tingley, Emerson equated with epistolary exchanges. Although the letter was sent to Abaya, it also represents an epistolary exchange with the dandelion, especially since Dickinson sees Abaya and the early spring flower as forever linked. This letter demonstrates Dickinson's imaginative use of scientific terminology, but it also shows a sophisticated and creative understanding of correspondence. In her letters, Dickinson corresponds with Abaya, but she also establishes correspondence with the dandelion. This correspondence, in both senses of the term, thus enables Dickinson to begin processing her diminishing friendship with Abaya. Although the letter is addressed to Abaya root, it is, in a real sense, rather delivered to the dandelion root. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry, for doing the video for us. As Thomas is not here for question and answer, we're just going to have question and answer for the two presenters who went before him. So if anybody has any questions, I would like to invite you to do so now. We could probably do two, I think. Anyone? Please don't be shy.
Before questions, I just want to add that I think this whole conference is organized in a wonderful way. I think it flows from boundaries to nature in a very organic way. I really love it, and I think we talk quite a lot about similar concepts, place, boundaries, and I think it fits all perfectly.
Yeah, agree. Junji, go ahead.
Okay, actually, I have a question. I have a question for Axel. When we talk about species, we often use names and categories based on scientific research to create a kind of fixed knowledge about individual beings. But nature obviously does not exist in this isolated and fixed way. Instead, relationships seems to become much more important, right? I'm reminded here of Marx's ideas that society is formed through a network of social relations. Maybe that's right. Perhaps the fundamental difference between humans and natures lies in these different ways of thinking. Ecology invites all species to exist within a web of relationships, while humans often separate, classify, and fix things, creating a more human-centered understanding of ecology. So Axel, as a philosopher who has thought deeply about these questions, I'd like to ask, how do you understand the ontological standard of relationships, and how is this related to what we call the essence of nature? Yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, thank you. I think the main message of my talk was the very fact that actually there's no one ontological nature of nature, and there's no one way of I mean, even when we say talking about nature, we should always put it in quotation marks because this is something that we do. But the nature doesn't care about whether we talk about it or not, or any other species. They don't really have an idea. I mean, they might, but they don't have to have an idea whether we talk about them or not. So these relations are asymmetrical. This is what I meant by this asymmetrical relations. We cannot really pin down to a particular philosophical definition. This is why I love when Derrida says the fact that the word animal actually doesn't mean anything because, I mean, we have to talk about the very specific animal we're talking about. I mean, even the word animal in itself, I mean, it just means a living thing. I mean, and even there, different philosophical religious traditions have different definitions of life. So according to a Buddhist definition of life, I mean, it will be completely different from a Judeo-Christian or other definition of life. So this is why I love to going back to the Greek understanding of, I mean, the fact that we're living things bestowed with language or logos, or we can also translate it as reason, or there are so many ways of interpreting what logos means. So the fact that we have logos is our way of understanding ourselves, but we're in this sphere, this transcendental sphere of understanding ourselves in a particular way, but we don't know whether, I don't know, dolphins or bobolinks, what are their concept of nature or being in relation to the world? For example, one particular example I find very interesting is the fact that we have this understanding of saving the planet. I mean, I don't know if there's so many animals who care about whether, I mean, they don't care about saving the environment or not. I mean, it's just something, there's so many concepts with which we're so, I mean, we're so embedded with, so that these relations are, I don't know if an ontology of that is even a possibility. So I think this would be one answer. I don't know if there's I don't know if we can talk about the isness of these relations, and I don't even know if we can consider all our beings in nature as symmetrically related to one another. So even when we talk about ecological relations or networks, I mean, the relations between different networks itself is a question. So I think Dickinson was aware of that. So this was the main point of my talk as well. I don't know if that answers to your question, but yeah.
Okay, so that's really inspiring. Thank you so much. Perhaps this is also opened an important direction for thinking about mushrooms. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samantha. Now, go ahead.
Yeah, I said in the chat, and I want to recommend a couple of texts to people. They're, 20 years old, but they're very useful. A book by Gregory Bowker and Susan Lee Starr called Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences. And then there are several books by George Lakoff that I think would be very useful.
Yeah. Lakoff. Yes, Lakoff.
Lakoff, yeah. Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things, for example. And then there's another one I put in the chat that escapes my mind right now. And in the last paper, I also said I was really glad to hear Stephanie Tingley's work mentioned. Her work deserves more attention and more of a shout out. So thank you for giving a shout out. And then the whole thing about nature, a question I put in there, Axel, is shouldn't we talk to more cosmologists? One of my dear friends, a cosmologist, passed last year, and I went to a celebration of his life, and listening to cosmologists who, they have some pretty serious disagreements. We think we have disagreements. They have really serious ones. But their conferences are so congenial, and because they understand that perspectives are so, we understand they're multiple, but they're also multifaceted and more like diamonds in terms of the way that perspectives are you know, except that they go on forever, whatever that means. Did that make any sense? Because your paper is responsible for me blabbing all that out, Axel.
I think it makes a lot of sense. I agree, and I really love the way you put it in terms of the diamond. And it's difficult to bring all these illuminations into a single definition or a singular. Though it all, I mean, it's. I think this is why the ancient Greeks basically talked about the cosmology, because this is what they tried to understand. They tried to understand it, the whole, not just particular appearances of it. But yeah, it's.
I don't even understand some of what they're talking. You know, I'm sitting there listening to them, and I was like, "Good grief!" But I learned a lot, and like, you know, I had no idea that galaxies cannibalize each other.
They do.
I mean, they just like say that casually, like, and you guys, I'm like, they do?
Yeah, they do.
And they said, yeah, the Milky Way, I forget which galaxy the Milky Way ate, but we ate a galaxy, or our galaxy did. So why is that relevant to what we're talking about? I mean, I do think that Dickinson I've long said that her theme song is probably Cole Porter's. Notice I'm not saying it's Bruce Springsteen's. It's Cole Porter's Don't Fence Me In. But we're always trying to contain her, you know? We're always trying to say her poems are best presented in these containers, as if they're Grecian urns. That's crazy. Her art is more serious than that and more profound than that. And I hope no one will think it's scandalous for me to say her art is like Yoko Ono's. It breaks things, and then we put things back together. It demands that of us. I love that. I'm sorry.
I love that.
No, we're listening. This is
Yeah.
like listening to a
It's
guru.
just, I get so furious at people trying to put Dickinson in containers. You don't have to think she had lesbian. I mean, I think you're crazy if you don't think she had lesbian erotics, but that's okay with me. I don't care. I want to know how her poetry speaks to you. There's no right or wrong. And I'm sick of, let's have a conference about no containers. This one is about connections.
The ineffable Dickinson.
Yeah.
Dickinson at the limit of language, to borrow what Axel was saying, because that really resonated with me. This is the last thing I think we have time for, because there's, you know, people have to take a break. But yeah, existing at the limit of language like that, using a phenomenological structure to discuss Dickinson is just so appropriate.
Can I give one more suggestion? Robert Frost has a great essay about all thinking is metaphor. I'll distribute it at some point.
Okay.
It is absolutely amazing. And he starts out, you know, he's really crotchety, and he says, and he's talking about boys at Amherst College, and he said, we all complain that they don't know how to think. That's because we don't tell them how to think. And then he just waxes rhapsodic about how all thinking is metaphor.
Great. And also very Lakoff. And thank you so much, Martha, now for your comment.
Oh, the other book, Metaphors to Live By.
Metaphors to Live By.
Yeah.
But Women, Fire, and
Dangerous Things.
Dangerous Things has Dickinson in it, just in case anybody's interested. Anyway, thus concludes our panel. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll be moving to a break now.
Okay.